parts of the same entity, really. And this webinar is on the topic of charging's next phase. A different kind of charging is needed to optimize returns from 5G. And it's me, Frank Healy, here from previously OpenNet, now Amdocs, and I'm joined here, thankfully, by Mark Collins, who's taking some time out of his day today from his busy schedule of meetings with a large number of operators. And thank you, Mark, a seasoned veteran, he won't mind me saying, of telecoms and charging in particular. And he won't mind me saying he's an industry expert and maybe an industry giant, Mark, amongst other things, especially when it comes to charging and all things monetization.
You're gonna make me blink, but thank you.
Okay, so let's fast forward. A few logistical issues for today that I'll be in trouble if I don't go through. So options, I know some people may be struggling a little bit to get audio, depending on how their technical setup is, so they can dial in if they prefer. I think there's options on email that have been sent around. Today, we'll have a Q&A box, which people should be able to see at the bottom of their screen. So please do feel free to pop in Q&A at the bottom, and we'll cover them off as best as we can. We'll be aiming for about 40 to 45 minutes on this today, 50 at a push, hopefully, with some Q&A. We are recording this webinar, so it'll be possible to pick up afterwards, and slides and material will be available afterwards, so don't worry about. I heard a rumor that some people like to kind of screen grab and things like that, Mark, so which is we wouldn't want to put people to that trouble, so they can get the slides afterwards, no problem. And at the end, we will be doing a small survey, so if people could kindly take the time to give us their feedback, that would be great. So let's crack on.
Cool. So for everybody else, I don't know about you, Frank, but I'm going to turn off my video until we come back to some of the Q&A at the end. But
okay, no problem.
Nice to meet you all. We'll hopefully explain more at the end.
I'll probably dip out a video myself at some stage. But so we're going to start with this inevitable scene setting slide, let's call it. And the main point really is that 5G has been around for a while now. You can see from the trend graph on the left-hand side of this slide that 5G is beyond proof of concept now at this stage. We've moved very successfully, really, in the case of some operators, into successful launch and uptake of fixed wireless access, particularly in the US market. And this year, I believe, according to the consensus, there will be over 1 billion 5G connections globally. By the time we finish out this year, the expectation is that there will be over 10 million fixed wireless access connections in the USA, building on the success of 2021. So, with the dramatic uptake of 5G fixed wireless access in the USA and those connections, so it feels like that we're, despite ourselves as an industry, we're at a kind of a tipping point beyond 5G fixed wireless access. And the question today is, what are the implications for charging? Where are we all going to go to next in terms of monetization of 5G after this first stage, let's call it. So let's go forward and explore that today. So Mark, maybe you want to jump in there.
Yeah, so I think, as you can see here, we're trying to illustrate some of what's coming in the 3GPP standards for 5G. And as most people will probably be aware, it's evolving in very different and very detailed ways, addressing capabilities for a huge variety and diversity of vertical solutions and different service provider types. And as Frank said a couple of minutes ago, it feels like we're at a tipping point right now as we head beyond some of the initial deployments of 5G. So from everything we're seeing currently, there's no question that enterprises are already taking stock of what's possible and beginning to make increased demands of service providers. And we also believe that the diversity of opportunities, as well as the requirements that we're seeing here, are going to present interesting challenges for service providers for some time to come. So I guess where does this leave us in terms of monetization and charging in particular? Like one of the things that we're going to share today is some of our experiences and some of our lessons learned. But our experience so far has been that service providers don't necessarily see all of this standards diversity as their biggest problem today. And that many are actually focused on other cross-cutting concerns, some of which we're going to talk about as we go through the webinar.
So the key point there, Mark, I think is am I right in saying that, you know, we've got to, as an industry, look way beyond the 3GPP standards to kind of what charging can provide and where it's going. All that has gone before. 5G is just not enough, you know. But you know, having said that, I think this is probably a point to just do some shameless promotion here of a recently published paper that we did on some 5G charging use cases. We've been working on with a tier 1 North American operator and AWS, which is available from our website. And it does point to a near future with many millions of new connections, and in particular V2X, vehicle to X use cases, and how real this is becoming in terms of scaling up and back and the breathability of networks. But we'll have more on that later, Mark.
Yep, absolutely. So if we start looking at some of the key areas of evolution for service providers, I guess it's tempting for vendors like us to over-focus on 5G and not place it in the context of a wider landscape. Some of our experience to date would point to the fact that cloud as well as convergence are equally as large concerns for service providers. So that's what you see illustrated here. 3 big areas that telecoms operators are dealing with. Cloud in particular is driving a mind shift in terms of dealing with some of the more dynamic natures of the way systems are going to work. And it's almost a prerequisite to getting to the benefits from 5G from our experience. And we also see a huge focus on simplification and convergence, which remains a major challenge for operators. Let's face it, 4G is going to be around for quite some time to come, and other legacy technologies besides, especially in your charging domain. And with your charging evolution, you still need to monetize legacy services as you evolve the network for future benefits. And I think one of the things we're going to try and do, Frank, over the rest of the webinar is come back to a number of these topics,
right,
progress through.
Yeah, so think of this as a kind of an anchor slide. So with that in mind, you know, no true webinar no webinar is a real webinar these days without a quick poll. So with those 3 bubbles in mind that Mark had of cloud, convergence, and 5G on the previous slide, what we wanted to do was ask the question: when does your organization consider those areas as driving charging evolution within the next, or what does your organization consider as the main areas driving charging evolution within the next 3 years? Is it A, 5G, B, moving to cloud, C, convergence, or D, all of the above? And I think you should see a poll on screen now. We'll just give it a minute. And we have our own views on this, Mark. I know you and I might differ slightly on it, but not too much. That'll be interesting to see if we just give it a minute as to what people.
Alicia, to confirm that, yeah, here we go. It's up on the screen now. So,
okay.
Yeah, so I guess like one of the things that's been interesting for me, Frank, over the course of the last year or so is seeing the real diversity that's out there with different operators that we're working with. Some starting from the 5G perspective and others starting from the convergence perspective.
Yeah.
That's there we go. So that's an interesting set of results.
Okay.
Nobody comes for convergence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't surprise me because I think we did some work online on this, and all of the above tends to pull people's attention anyway. And I think these topics are so interwoven with each other that people are going to plump for that one, really. The three bubbles that you had on your previous slide, they're all drivers of each other, And it just goes to prove what we've been hinting at already, that 5G is not the only thing driving charging. It's not the only thing driving monetization in the industry. And that's very consistent with an online poll that we did over the last, I think, number of weeks. So, you can see there that maybe not as decisively, but people went for the all of the above option when it was available to them there as well in the last couple of weeks. And no surprise there that they're all intertwined with each other.
A good mix, but it's going to bear out, I hope, some of the points we're going to make as we go through this webinar, that it's not just about 5G. Like a lot of the operators that we're working with are following different goals, different objectives, some of which are a mix of all of these things.
So I think there's there's been so much heavy focus on 5G over the last few years within the telco space. Yes, you forget that we're in a bit of a bubble sometimes. Maybe we should be thinking more about those three bubbles instead of just the one.
Well, I'm going to pull us out of the poll bubble for a second, right? So, well, one of the things that we wanted to do as part of the webinar was to take that measure of what people were thinking, but also to look specifically at charging, given that's our focus here. And I guess one question we ask is, why does 5G get people so excited? And that includes us, by the way. Certainly from a product marketing perspective, I know it enthuses Frank, and from a product management perspective, it drives a lot of discussions we have with customers about where our product is evolving and what it's going to support in the future. And to answer the question, why does it get people so excited? I think one of the things I feel is it's because of the potential for new value that will be driven out of the network and the increased efficiency in how the rollout of new features can be controlled and automated. There's a lot of promise in what the 5G standards have defined. But there's also lots of hot topics and buzzwords, especially relating to slicing, edge, and machine learning. Now, how do you translate all of those to charging related concerns? In my view, networks might be focused on connectivity, but charging is impacted by much more than that. Like, one of the things we have to remember is how 5G encompasses new devices, partnership capabilities via APIs, and the network exposure capabilities that are defined in the standards. And as a result, it's going to lead to some pretty significant change in the business models behind monetization, with things like quality of service, SLAs, performance, counts on active devices, location, mobility, and I can go on, all driving the charging decisions that an operator wants to make for their network resources in time. So let me take a step back for a second. So I guess what that poses for me is whether the advanced nature of some of the 5G capabilities is actually the real challenge for operators. One of the things that we've been discovering through working with customers from a 5G deployment and a charging deployment perspective is that there's quite a few roadblocks out there to the envisioned future of 5G. It's not all going to be easy for operators to adopt. And one of the things that we've come to realize is that the foundations perhaps need some rework, especially in relation to the choices operators need to make on which cloud they're going to use, how they're going to rationalize some of their existing silos, and even looking at the organizational enablement itself. Like, I'll give you one anecdote. When it came to cloud choices, we've had one or two situations where we've been talking to customers about selling our charging system, and they had yet to make their decision about which cloud that they were going to deploy us on before they even made the decision to pick us from a charging perspective. And that created some interesting dynamics in project planning terms, where you were not sure which cloud you were going to be deployed on, and the operator was still trying to make that decision post choosing the charging solution that they were picking. So I don't know, Frank, do you want to comment on the statistic that we're showing here?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting statistic, I think, and it's one I keep going back to, even in the context of 5G, and it's because it's slightly predated maybe the true rollout of 5G, if you like, that statistic at the top that we had from research in late 2020, that at that point in time, more than 40% of CSPs had more than 50 revenue management systems. And then, if you think about it, you add 5G on top of that, and is there complexity today any less than it was 2 years ago? Chances are it's possibly even more complex for a lot of operators. So with all that in mind, then, you know, all the things that you're talking about there that have come with 5G, with cloud, and the requirements for scalability and automation and all of that, you know, there's no question that the complexity has accumulated for a lot of operators. It was hard enough in 4G. It has been added to, I would say, with 5G.
Absolutely. So one of the things I want to share a little bit now is some of the interesting lessons from early 5G projects that we've seen with some of our customers. Working with customers on the introduction of 5G, charging has led to some very complex discussions on the service-based architecture and what discoverability means in the context of the dynamic nature of 5G networks. And that also has ended up tying in conversations about the interworking with other core vendors in the 5G ecosystem as you deal with that discoverability and dynamic nature. So that in turn has led to a lot of evolutions in thinking on what it means to be highly available, geo-redundant, and how networking is even managed. Like we've had to challenge a lot of legacy thinking based on the differences between old style system deployments and the change that comes from working in the cloud. Like one example I can give is that to benefit from the cloud, you also have to embrace some of the dynamic scaling practices, but that also changes the approach to how you address a sizing or a dimensioning of the attended system. And I guess, let's face it, when you look to deploy a new system, for a long time, the sizing requirement from an operator has been based on looking at the worst case peak scenario envisaged in the next 3 to 5 years based on their previous buying practices. The cloud doesn't work like that, especially if you want to realize any sort of cost savings. So I've mentioned cloud a few times already, but we can't talk about the evolution of charging without talking about the cloud. And I guess some of you might ask, why is that? I think over the course of the last 3 years or so, we've had as many conversations with customers about cloud and the non-functional and operational implications as we've had about charging functionality, which for many customers is almost a given or taken for granted. The non-functional side of things in particular is the area that will bring a lot of the efficiencies and improvements in how an operator works into the future. And a lot of the commercial decisions that operators are making now have very long-term implications. So at Amdocs and Openet, we've always aimed to be cloud agnostic, meaning we want to build a product that's applicable to many different cloud infrastructure choices. And our experience so far is that the diversity of choice is leading operators to make a huge range of varying decisions based on whether they're embracing the public cloud providers or aiming to build their own private cloud. And we've experienced at the moment of deploying our charging system in all of these scenarios, embracing everything from VMware, OpenShift, and even on to some of the public clouds provided by Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. We've also mentioned convergence as a big theme already, but one other area that's probably having as much, if not more, change for operators is the topic of security. And it's a massive area of change for both us as a vendor and operators in general. Why is security big? Because deploying in a public cloud changes the walled system nature of how charging systems were protected in the past. And the rapid nature of change of threats and issues that arise in the internet world is leading to a lot more frequent cycles from a system update or upgrade perspective. And what we're finding is that you have to embrace a more rapid cadence, which in turn is leading to change in how we work with operators to test and deploy changes into the live production environments. So we've mentioned how we've seen change, but we've also experienced a huge change in the knowledge required to design, operate, and maintain charging systems deployed into the cloud environment. The nature of some of the new technologies involved is driving a lot of change for our customers in the context of the training and upskilling required. And it's particularly prevalent in areas such as networking, tools like Kubernetes and Helm, and the whole approach to configuring a system for scaling operations. So I'm going to give you two, what might sound simple anecdotal examples, but in one network deployment for our 5G charging function, the networking team failed to recognize the multipath nature of how charging interacts with the network function like the session management function or the SMF. The network team that were setting up all of the communications between the different systems allowed communications between the SMF and the NRF for registration purposes, but somehow managed to block communications between the SMF and the CHF, which meant that all requests were failing in initial testing. Now, this might sound stupid, right? But the lesson learned was that the networking team, who were used to much more legacy deployment implementations, needed to be educated on the implications of moving to a service-based network, which is what 5G is all about. In the same scenario, the networking team also started using basic ping to troubleshoot to figure out what was and wasn't working. And obviously that wasn't successful due to the nature of the microservices-based architecture that we were using, which includes a mixture of ingress load balancers and virtual IP addresses all over the place. And what became clear was that a lot of new tools were needed to support troubleshooting in this cloud-based containerized environment. So like I said, those organizational impacts are very much driving a need for training and upskilling when you're adopting a new charging system or you're adopting the new cloud technologies that come with that decision making.
So I think Mark, just to add, I think what you're saying there mainly is that all these new functions, and I think the next slide highlights that as well, that all these new functions need to do a better job of speaking to each other, and charging just happens to be a key part of that story, and a central part of that story, perhaps because it's what will drive value from all of those other functions.
Absolutely. So like coming back from that kind of sideline implications of the new world order when it comes to 5G and modern charging systems, let's come back to 5G a little specifically, and I'll maybe elaborate on Frank's point there. So like 5G is introducing more and more capabilities as each 3GPP release is published, which essentially is adding to the myriad of additional network functions that are now reliant on the 5G CHF as an endpoint for charging events and transactions. Frank mentioned that it's at the center of everything, and it's literally at the center of everything when it comes to how all of these network nodes have to call the CHF for monetization use cases, which is quite a departure from the past, where CDR records might have been picked up from any network node, mediation would have done its job, and then charging or billing would have been involved in the monetization flow. Now you have this hard dependency on one CHF deployment to deal with the monetization requirements of a lot of the 5G network events that are generated. So the diagram we have here illustrates a few of these. I'm not going to bore you with the acronym bingo. I'm sure everybody is well familiar with network functions and their 3-letter or 4-letter acronyms. But the wheel that you see here traverses from traditional services like data and policy into very different models of interaction when it comes to network functions relating to access and mobility, how network analytics are in turn translated to charging events, and how API transactions might even influence charging for a partner party. And so from what we can see here, there's a variety of different charging strategies that are going to be required to address how the network and communications usage on the network is monetized. And I think, like, most of us will remember the proverbial 5G triangle from some of the early days of when release 15 and 5G itself was announced to the world from a 3GPP perspective. And at the time, there would have been lots and lots of discussion about the varying use cases that were going to be related to enhanced mobile broadband, to massive transaction numbers in IoT, and even what might still be being defined in the context of what it meant for ultra low latency and reliability type use cases. But the main thing that this points to for me as a charging product manager is that all of those scenarios need very different charging models. They all rely on a different set of mechanisms when it comes to what you're counting, what you're monitoring, what you're keying off to decide how you're going to charge the customer and what exactly they're paying for. And I think one of the big things that we're seeing at the moment is that in the charging of tomorrow, we're going to see a lot of new evolving models for access-based charging, which is definitely going to move away from the idea of monitoring volume of data usage from devices, particularly when those IoT devices, for example, generate a lot less traffic and only connect when they're required. We've already had a number of discussions with customers about API-based charging via the network exposure function. Amdocs also has some experience in building the NEF itself, and we've been working very closely with a couple of our product teams to bring those two products together. But that charging mechanism is very much focused on SLAs, transaction volume, access via different API paths, whatever it might be that you're going to expose as the service for the end customer. And it also comes with an assumption of a different kind of payee than you would normally have in the context of either individual customers or perhaps enterprises or groups of customers. And I guess work your way around to the bottom, and there's an even slightly more fuzzy future of how network analytics via the analytics function and the CEF combination, which is very much something we see closely aligned with the charging system. They're going to alter the charging models for more likely enterprise scenarios, and it's going to get very, very interesting in time. And I think the big thing that we shouldn't forget is the expanded role of policy control within both user and network policy interactions, which charging is very closely aligned to. So I think key point here is that the 5G services with all of those 5G network functions, they're going to need a different kind of charging capability, very much designed and defined for 5G, and not just the way charging systems have worked in the past. Like I think the 5G APIs have been very clear on the types of data that can be captured, but what makes it interesting is how you construct the models behind them to generate the ultimate charges that the customer pays. Don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Frank?
No, this one covers a lot of ground, and I know you could talk about it for an hour on its own. So I think we'll crack on. Crack on. And we'll, by the way, before I forget, we'll mention NEF again later on. I think it's a very hot topic at the moment, the network exposure function and implications for operators. We'll come back to it in a few slides.
And so I know when we did the poll earlier, the audience didn't necessarily crack on convergence as being a big thing. But I think one of the things we saw in the LinkedIn poll and what we've seen with a lot of our customers is that there's still a lot of facets to convergence out there that our customers are grappling with in the context of charging. And I guess the biggest aspect to that is the fact that 5G doesn't sit alone, right? We've seen how different operators are tackling this from a number of different directions. So one North American operator we're working very closely with has started with 5G charging and sought to focus on how to monetize their 5G network investment from the get-go. And now what they're doing is making incremental additions to the charging stack we've put in place for 5G, incorporating 4G and legacy services bit by bit into one converged charging and rating stack. And in parallel with all of this, they've been also modernizing other aspects of their BSS infrastructure in parallel. In contrast to that, we also have a number of other customers looking to evolve their charging offerings and whom are much, much more focused on addressing stack simplification and consolidation. And that kind of covers some of our customers in Europe, in one or two in APAC, and a different North American customer. And their focus has very much been on the convergence of a lot of their disparate systems where they would still have had a legacy set of stacks associated with charging for prepay and postpay, for consumer and business, whatever it might be, right? And introducing another dedicated monetization function for 5G wasn't something that they wanted to do. So they've taken the approach of trying to consolidate things as a precursor to 5G and as a precursor to adopting some of the 5G APIs for the 5G services that they want to roll out. And I think it's inevitable that operators are going to need support for both legacy services and 5G in parallel. I think the thing we've learned is each operator has a different view on how they're going to get there. And what we've tried to do, at least, is to build our charging system with that inevitable difference between operator choices in mind. So probably summarizing that, we try not to be a one-size-fits-all, even though we're trying to build the box product for every customer, but we do recognize that there's a lot of variation out there.
Yeah, I think that's the point, isn't it? That there's a different trajectory per operator almost. You know, they have a different envisioned future now from each other, but possibly it's not all about smartphones. So, you know, some of them want to evolve their 4G and start gently with 5G, and then some of them want to be more aggressive with 5G and consume 4G, or they want their 5G to absorb what was 4G.
Or they're willing for the two to sit separately for the time being, but they have a long-term objective to get to one single charging system for everything.
Right.
Cool. So I guess this slide is probably a bit by way of a summary into a lot of what we've said already. Like, there's a lot of key issues that we've talked about relating to the coexistence in a charging context of 5G with, I guess, what you would call the so-called other Gs and networks. And this also relates to cloud convergence and the organizational changes that we've mentioned. But all of these things essentially allow us as an industry to pivot firmly into some of the new value spaces that 5G enables. Some of these are illustrated on the slide, encompassing consumer, B2B, and other lines of business within an operator environment. But a lot of these new value spaces are very varied and dependent on operator strategy. So, for example, you might have an IoT line of business, and there might be a lot of things you want to do with your 5G network. Will you start looking at AMF and NEF charging as a thing that will become real in the near future or not? Likewise, a lot of the operators that we're talking to are looking at not just consumer offerings for 5G, but also the enterprise and wholesale aspects of what they can provide with their 5G networks. And that probably ties in aspects of the standards that relate to tenant charging and things like network slicing management, which is going to be an ongoing evolution and change for what operators embrace. So one of the final points I guess I'll make here is that our goal with Amdocs Charging Solutions is to address both old and new use cases for monetization on a single converged platform for charging. And our goal is to address all these lines of business. And we constantly have to evolve based on operator need when it comes to the adoption of the so-called advanced 5G use cases. And I guess one of the questions we're going to pose in a second is for the members of our audience here that are part of perhaps the operator world, how quickly they see some of these things becoming real.
I'll just mention there, while I have the chance, and you mentioned SLA there, or you mentioned slicing there, Mark. There was an announcement today, I think, around work that Amdocs is doing with A1 Group in relation to slicing, and a live demonstration of slicing. So it has taken a while, hasn't it? For some of those things to come good. And the trouble, there's been a fair bit of skepticism. But of course, the trouble with skepticism is it's anchored in the past. These things are happening now and happening at pace.
I have no doubt. Before I joined OpenNet years ago, Frank, I would have worked in an operator here in Ireland, and the guys in the network world were constantly experimenting with new products and services. And me, who was sitting in the charging billing arena, usually found out last minute when they had something that they wanted to sell to a customer. Is like, now how are we going to monetize it? Right. So I have no doubt that there's experiments with slicing and slicing management going on within both Amdocs and some of our operators as customers. I guess what we're trying to do from a product management perspective is think ahead in terms of how that will be monetized using our product, which is definitely part of the roadmap evolution.
Right. And of course, the monetization will decide whether or not that experimentation can happen in the first place. So let's hope it's a bit more joined up now than it was two or three years ago, Mark, when you were working.
I'm a skeptic. You have to find something that works and decide how you're going to charge a customer for it.
Right. So
cool. Anyway, to the next one.
Yeah. So with that in mind, maybe now that we've had the practice, we've had the poll practice already. So another poll is surely in order, and we wanted to ask people about timeframes this time, and with all the considerations around 5G. As to when do they think their business will need to change in terms of 5G adaptation? Are they already doing it? Is it more likely to be 2 years from now, 3 years from now, or even longer? And by the way, it doesn't matter if people on the call are service providers or not, because obviously 5G is going to touch on most businesses and impact most people in some way or other. So when do they see this as happening? I think it will be interesting to see.
So what while the poll is going on there, Frank, I'm just going to take the opportunity to answer one of the questions that Luke Eve posed.
Okay.
He asked the question, is I kind of understand the indirect relationship between NWDAF and charging, but is there a more direct impact that you could elaborate on? Like Frank said, I could probably go into utterly low-level detail with regards to the different possibilities that the standards introduce, but I guess the big thing that we're looking at with regards to the NWDAF and charging is the different slicing reports or different network analytics reports that can be generated, and how we can use that information for both monetization and for operational use cases. Like in terms of direct impact, it's very much focused on how you feed information from the NWDAF into the so-called charging enablement function of the CEF, which is in turn the one that's going to be responsible for triggering the charging events. And I think for us in OpenEd, at least, there's still a lot of work to figure out how that actually translates to real models and what the monetization use cases are actually going to look like. But one area that we have been working with our network analytics colleagues, given we've got a product in this space as well, is how we can use some of those network analytics reports to trigger different behaviors within the optimizations of our system, particularly for example, how we would manage quota on the network. Like one of the things we can potentially key off with analytics reports is where we see either congested networks or otherwise, and on the basis of that decide to grant more or less quota depending on how we optimize transactions in the charging system. I may not have answered the question directly, but there is lots of different concerns relating to how NWDAF works.
So are you thinking more as to how it relates back to an SLA type enterprise user, Mark, or are you thinking, or does it matter, you know?
I think what I'm saying is there's still a lot to be worked out. Like we're trying to work our way through what the analytics reporting allows you to determine. And from that, then trying to build the models around whether it drives operational or monetization related use cases for charging.
Right, okay. Okay, so there was no surprise there, by the way. I think the majority of people were thinking in terms of 1 to 2 years. It didn't look like people were stretching it out beyond 3 years. So no surprise. Maybe we were a bit leading with that question, but however.
Yeah, that's fair.
Let's keep going.
Cool. So I guess we're getting on the back straight now in terms of the webinar. So we've covered a lot so far. I guess let's focus a tiny bit on the Amdocs charging offering, right? So Amdocs OpenEd charging has been very much built to be cloud native. This is the DNA that we've been adopting for the last 2 or 3 years. It's been built very much to support a rapid cadence model with our customers, and it addresses both the automated deployment and elasticity goals that we believe are key in a cloud environment. But they're like, I'm not going to read through all of the items on the screen here, but nevertheless, they're all active topics of conversations with operator customers who are looking to adopt some of the modernization we can provide from a charging perspective. But I want to touch on 2 very specifically. So cloud native and microservices-based containerization has been synonymous for the last few years, at least in the expectation of telcos. And one of the things we're seeing is that embracing more cloud native technologies and even specific technologies and tools from the public cloud vendors is going to be a huge topic in the coming years. We're already seeing this in discussions with a couple of the operators that we're working with and bidding for business with. The second thing I wanted to touch on very briefly was the fact that observability and operability has also been a big area of change for operators. Cloud changes how you do things, how you monitor a system, and also changes the skills and knowledge your employees need to have. We see this evolving an awful lot further as more and more of our deployments scale up in the cloud environments that we're deployed in. So we've got a lot of tooling already put in place, but there's a lot more to adopt when it comes to how we would leverage public cloud tooling or even specific tools that customers want to adopt separately from buying the charging system, given the goal should be to have a lot of their network infrastructure in the cloud. And
I'm glad, Mark, just to jump in, Mark, on that one, I'm glad you picked operability and Was it usability as one of your top picks? Because we've talked a lot about ilities, non-functional ilities in the past as providing a lot of value to operators, and it's where the conversation keeps going. Right up through the IT stack. How their business people are able to kind of generate use cases on the fly, or create use cases and do A/B testing on the fly is a hot topic for them on an ongoing basis, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I think just to round out a little bit about the Openet charging evolution, right? So as many of you know, Openet is now part of Amdocs, given Openet was acquired a number of years ago by Amdocs. And the convergence of the Amdocs and Openet companies brings an awful lot more to the table for an operator, both in terms of charging capabilities, but also in regards to the place of charging in the wider Amdocs BSS revenue management, customer management ecosystem. One of the things that we've been working on for quite a while is the incorporation of the Amdocs Openet charging system into the Amdocs Revenue One charging capability superset in terms of what's possible within the Amdocs product world. I think, like, we've illustrated some of the themes and issues we address with our now combined capabilities here on the slide. As a combined company and with a combined set of products, we serve both network and IT stakeholders equally. We serve multiple different lines of business, and we're actively deploying in the field for prepay, postpay, and enterprise use cases. And one of the key things I think to point out is that we also now have a single roadmap across Openet and Amdocs addressing the evolution of charging within Amdocs. And our vision for charging is very much the ability to cater for all of these use cases and more with one combined system, which is the goal we have for the evolution of everything that was acquired and brought together. So I'm going to hand back to Frank now, and we'll start a bit of wrap up as we begin to get to the close of the webinar.
Yeah, so I think to try and crystallize all this, because there's a lot here, right? So we should just summarize and try and conclude a little bit that charging already was a challenge with 4G, and there were a lot of silos, a lot of lines of business doing their own thing in a very most likely a pretty inefficient way. And relatedly, charging versus billing was a dichotomy that existed and was often unnecessary, as Mark touched on, and online and offline practices were often handled separately. So experiences of 5G with charging as a focal point are providing a vehicle for further 5G and 4G efficiencies, especially when it comes to cloud and the wider service-based architecture of the SBA. So agnosticism and the choice of tools remain key challenges for operators that, in terms of the discussions that we're having, especially when it comes to cloud. Organizational changes will really matter. Things like CI/CD, DevOps, business team enablement, the ability to respond rapidly, those kind of issues are really hot topics. And relatedly, as we touched on, partnership done well with the right adjacent functions. And I'm thinking here, Mark, of the NEF that you mentioned on one of your earlier slides. By the way, I should mention here, keep an eye out for another upcoming webinar from Amdocs and Openet on the topic of NEF, network exposure function, in the coming weeks. So the fuller set of 5G enablement needs to be a more, I would say, fully functional, cohesive, flexible, and user-oriented charging with fuller IT capability. Modern times require a more powerful capability, Mark, and that goes way beyond functions, standards, and features, and provides a focus for value as well as a critical building block for whatever use cases come in the future.
100%, and I think that like we've probably highlighted as part of the webinar, that's been a key thing, that it's not just about the functionality, although that's important. It's about what it does for the operator's business and how it makes things better, more efficient, easier to run, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that focal point, I think, is really key. Value-based focal point, of course.
Yeah. So like on that point, we weren't prepared. So it might sound trite, but at the core of how we look at charging, it's actually seeing it as the single source of truth for all aspects of network monetization. And I hope one of the things that we've gotten across as a point here is the fact that that in itself is evolving massively with the introduction of 5G. And the number of things that now become part of the charging domain or linked to the charging domain when it comes to decision making around how you're going to charge and monetize your customer base. It certainly has evolved a lot of my thinking from a product management perspective around what charging and billing actually means.
So with, just as a reminder to watch out for our latest paper on this topic, which covers the things that we mentioned in this webinar and drills a good bit deeper. And it's the charging's next phase is the white paper to watch out for. I think it should be coming out this week or maybe as we speak. And the subheading on it is, of course, a different kind of charging is needed to optimize returns from 5G. In other words, it's not all about pure 5G functionality. It's more encompassing than that, as we've mentioned.
Frank, just one thing related to this white paper. In the coming days, you will receive an email with the recording, the presentation, and with this white paper as well. So keep an eye on your inbox that you should receive in the coming days this information.
Great. Thanks, Alicia. Thanks for that. So with that in mind, I think we're at the point of, we're bang on time. So we're at the point of Q&A. So I'm just going to have a look. I think there was one.
So there's actually no open questions, Frank, because I've been trying to answer a few as we went along, but we touched on one live that we talked to there. So, but
okay,
if there's any other questions that people have at this point, feel free to stick them into the Q&A box, and we'll try.
Yeah, I did have one before the webinar started, Mark, and I thought it was a nice question actually, and it came from. It was pretty timely actually, because it's maybe something that people have been wondering about. It is a pretty simple one on a certain level, and it's like the question I think was for you really, Mark, more than it might have been for me, but it was how has life been in OpenNet inside Amdocs? So somebody being a bit provocative maybe, but I guess they're talking there about how have we been working together.
So I guess there's many different facets to that. So like emotionally, how has it been? It's been an interesting couple of years, definitely, with regards to the size and scope of the number of customers we now end up talking to, just based on the sheer scale that Amdocs brings to the conversation when it comes to what OpenNet now has access to. And I guess turning it on the other perspective, like from a product evolution side of things, it's been equally interesting, because those customer conversations have led us down new paths in terms of what our customers are interested in, how that ties us much closer into the Amdocs product suites, which is something that we've been very much working on since we were acquired. One of the first things that happened after the acquisition was that the product management organization were brought pretty much into the fold with regards to how OpenNet was being treated as a set of products. And on the basis of that, we've been actively working our roadmaps for well over a year and a half now, with convergence, integration, and a bunch of other things as high-level themes and goals in mind. But that whole objective is beginning to come to fruition now in terms of what we're able to do in common deployments with our Amdocs product colleagues, and also how we're seeing that translating to live deployments of our systems integrated with some of the Amdocs portfolio. So it's been pretty exciting. I don't want to harp on the theme that the new Amdocs branding talks about, but it has been pretty amazing for me, coming from OpenNet as a smaller product management team, to start working with tens and hundreds of other colleagues across the wider organization, with what it both helps us learn and also brings to us as information.
It's a lot of reach and a lot more portfolio, isn't it? So I mean, I think we're going to just wrap up just about there. Okay, I think if you want to flick on, I think there's just a contact page there that where people can reach out to us directly. I'm sure there'll be a few questions. I think there's one or two still coming in, and if they want to reach out to us directly, myself, Frank Healy, or Mark Collins,